Welcome everyone to our first lecture in our new event series exploring trade, travel and interconnections along the Nile Valley. And today, kicking off this theme is Dr. Kathleen Sheppard. Kate is Professor in History and Political Science in Missouri, and she's published on the history of Egyptology, notably, of course, her most recent book, Tea on the Terrace, Hotels and Egyptologists Social Networks, 1885 to 1925. Before we get started, I just want to say a very special thank you to Kate for not only giving this lecture, but also being hugely supportive for our own efforts here at the ES. Kate actually really helped me write the introduction to our 2022 reprint of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, a book written by Amelia Edwards, our founder, and it's really an important introduction because Kate helped us to formulate the right wording around how we talk about Amelia's legacy. If you've not got a copy of that book, please do consider purchasing a copy today. And today, of course, taking inspiration from Amelia's title, Kate is going to talk about 1,000 ways to go 1,000 miles, exploring the different ways that people traveled up and down the Nile. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kate. Over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous introduction. And I suggest if you haven't gotten your hands on one of those copies of the new edition of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, you should, because it's just so well done. And I'm not in my home office right now, but I normally have it. I was just telling Carl and Charlotte, I normally have it sort of sitting right next to me because I reference it so often. It is just so wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So to start, I'm going to quote 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. And Amelia Edwards said, quote, "Such is the esprit du Nil. The people in dahabeahs despise Cook's tourists. Those who are bound for the second cataract look down with lofty compassion upon those whose ambitions extend only to the first. And travelers who engage their boat by the month hold their heads a trifle higher than those who contract for the trip. We, who were going as far as we liked and for as long as we liked, could afford to be magnanimous." End quote. This is how Amelia Edwards described travel up the Nile in a dahabeah, or houseboat, in 1873. Back then, there wasn't a train that went all the way from Cairo to Aswan. In fact, the railway from Alexandria to Cairo was only completed 8 years before. Thomas Cook's tourist services had only established permanent offices and a regular steamer service in Cairo in 1873, the same year that Edwards and her group sailed up the Nile, so there were few options to go south of Cairo in those days. However, due to the influence of books like Lucy Duff Gordon's Letters from Egypt and Amelia Edwards' journey popularized in 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, along with the infrastructure built by Thomas Cook, hundreds of thousands of Western tourists descended on Egypt for the next 75 years. While each trip was as unique as each traveler, there were 3 main ways in these years to see the country: by dahabeah, by steamer boat, and by train. Today, we will travel up the Nile in each of these ways, talking about the practical benefits and drawbacks of each conveyance. In the end, I'd be interested to know, sort of what you think, which trip you might choose for yourself. And there's different adventures involved with each one. We'll see not only important sights and meet interesting travelers, guides, and dragomen along the way, we'll also see that while the presence of Western travelers in Egypt helped to build infrastructure throughout the country, they also left a legacy of colonialism that Egyptians and tourists are still grappling with today. Much of the tourist industry in Egypt was built by Thomas Cook, and in 1926, they argued, quote, "No country in the world has benefited more than Egypt from the enterprise of Messrs. Thomas Cook and Son." Thomas Cook started leading tourist groups in Egypt in 1869, and probably the first company to offer all-inclusive packages. Cook had been leading groups all around England in 1841 when he took over 400 people to a teetotal rally. And in 1855, he started taking groups through Europe. Cook's groups arrived in Egypt in 1869, and after teaming with his son John in 1872, the business grew. From 1873, Cook and Son had permanent offices in Egypt, first in Cairo next to Shepherd's Hotel, and from 1877 in Luxor at the Luxor Hotel, which Cook built. Infrastructure that could support Western tourists was instrumental to getting people to come to Egypt, and because of this, we have to talk about Cook when we talk about Western travel in Egypt. Ever interested in both making money and giving as many people as possible a solid trip worth their time, Cook made it possible for hundreds of thousands of people to travel all over the world. While in Egypt, we're going to look at options from the cheapest and quickest way, the train, to the most expensive and longest way, private houseboat. So pack your tinted spectacles, your wide-brimmed hat, your mosquito netting, and don't forget your guidebook if you want to follow along. I suggest using Baedekers. That's what I'll be using. Murray's and Cook's are also good. So let's go. Traveling up the Nile by train was made possible by the end of 1888, over 100 years after Westerners had been sailing up it on boats. But it was the cheapest way and the quickest way to travel. Thomas Cook liked to provide some mixed travel using a train to allow for time and expense while not sacrificing all the sights. Starting in December of 1888, Cook's offered a, quote, cheap express service, which was not a guided tour of Egypt like those that steamer passengers enjoyed, but instead the service was a train-steamer combination designed to take people to Luxor and Aswan much more quickly than by steamer alone. The express service involved taking the train from Cairo to Asyut, which was about 10 hours or 235 miles by rail, and still below or to the north of Luxor. It was as far as the train could go at that point. Once at Asyut, travelers could get on their pre-booked steamer or dahabeah, or find berth on a mail steamer if one was available. The itinerary would then take them to Baliana for Abydos and other sites, Dendera, and then on to Thebes at Luxor. Travelers could visit sites between Asyut and Luxor along the way if they chose. And those traveling this way would leave Cairo on a Tuesday and arrive in Luxor by Friday, which was really quick. Americans James Breasted and his wife Frances did this both on their honeymoon in 1894 to 95 and again in 1905 to 1906 on the advice of Flinders Petrie. But I'm not completely sure if they used Cook or not, although some of their dahabeah names were the same. Train travelers could still see the pyramids on their way out of town and watch the river go by. Cook offered a package deal for this trip because they offered package deals for most of their trips. In 1888, an 11-day trip to Luxor and back by train and steamer, cost travelers about 20 pounds, and a 15-day trip to Aswan and back cost 25 pounds. Servants would cost 10 pounds less because they took second class. So this would be around 1,800 pounds today, or $2,500 for the 11-day trip, or 2,300 pounds or $3,100 for the longer 15-day trip. Servants would cost around 1,000 pounds or $1,300 today for the 11-day trip, and about 1,500 pounds or $2,000 for the 15-day trip. While that doesn't sound like it's a lot, I'll do some sort of labor math here in just a minute. These costs would include train and steamer tickets, food on the steamer but not on the train, and accommodation at Luxor for 4 nights at either Cook's Luxor or Karnak hotels. Later on, when the train extended its southerly route, there were even shorter trips on the Nile, which would include taking a train from Cairo to Luxor or Aswan, then taking a Cook steamer or mail steamer back down the Nile at not a particularly leisurely pace. That trip would take about a week and could cost between 16 and 25 pounds. And these amounts are equivalent to between around 1,500 pounds or $2,000 and 2,200 pounds or $3,000 today. And all of this would be inclusive of room, board, and excursions once you got to Egypt. By 1898, if we look at our Baedekers Egypt, it would tell us that the completion of the railway from Cairo to Luxor would open up Egypt to travelers to move between Luxor and Aswan more easily. And they were right. From Cairo to Aswan by rail was 517 miles, which could take about 22 hours. Travelers had to switch at Luxor to take the narrow gauge train from Luxor to Aswan, another 100 miles or 6 hours away. From Cairo to Luxor by rail, it was a distance of 417 miles, which could take 16 hours. In fact, Baedeker suggested, quote, experienced travelers may hire a tent and a small canteen at Cairo, engage a donkey boy to act as cook and proceed by train, stopping at the places they intended to visit. This would allow anyone who had the time and desire to see the sites relatively cheaply, but also at their own pace. They could make the trip as long or as short as they wished and stopped at any sites along the way. And basically, it was a dahabeah-like option without the dahabeah cost. But I haven't found any extant reports of anyone doing this. If you do, if that's what you're looking at, I would love to hear about it. Because Cook always pushing a package deal, didn't actually even give this one as an option. Much like for travel up the Nile by boat, guidebooks like Baedeker's contain sections detailing how train passengers should prepare themselves for the trip and how to book their passage. To travel by train, first class was obviously the most comfortable for European travelers, but second class was acceptable if one wished, quote, to make a nearer acquaintance with the country and the people. This meant that second class passengers would be traveling with Egyptians and experiencing a different train experience than those in the wholly European first class. When traveling by train to Luxor, tourists were told they, quote, should provide themselves with a supply of meat, bread, and wine, as no stoppage is made for dinner. Eggs, bread, water are offered for sale at the stations. And you can see how many stations they're hitting on the way up. You'd need to bring your own water glass. Most importantly, as with everywhere they went in Egypt, travelers would be led by their guidebooks to watch out for sights out of their windows on their journey. On the way out of Cairo, the train would immediately cross to the west side of the Nile, and the right side of the train car had views of the pyramid field from Giza, here, to Dashur's Bent Pyramid. Upon arrival at El Wasta, which was 57 miles south of Cairo, travelers could change to take a train to the Fayum, stop to see sights around Wasta, or remain on the train to continue south immediately. Baedeker's guidebook rode with travelers all the way up the Nile, stopping at every rail station along the way, describing sights that could be seen at each location if passengers chose to get off the train. Most passengers would stay on the train if they were on the longer journey to Luxor or Aswan, but the option was always available. 345 miles after leaving Cairo, the train would cross an iron bridge going from the west to the east bank of the river at Nag Hammadi, which had been the end of the line in 1897. It then traveled another 72 miles to Luxor. The station in Luxor was in the southeast of town, where it remains, and passengers would change here for the narrower gauge rail line to Aswan. The main point here was that the journey was quick on the train. One could go to Luxor and back in a matter of days, and the narrative in several guidebooks was correspondingly brief. The relative affordability of the train in time and expense allowed for, quote, persons of less ample means to see some sights on the way to Luxor as well as sights further south. Many archaeologists, especially those on a budget like Flinders Petrie and James Breasted before he had Rockefeller money, would take trains to get to their sites quickly and cheaply. In fact, the Egypt Exploration Fund, now the Egypt Exploration Society, who's hosting this talk today, had an agreement with Thomas Cook that those working for the fund would be eligible for half-rate tickets. It's unclear if the rate reduction was meant for all forms of travel, including boats, but one can assume it was meant for at least train tickets. Egyptologists also combined modes of travel. Many who would take a train would also use steamers and dahabeahs on those same trips. Thomas Cook's steamer itinerary was fairly consistent at the beginning of Cook's service in 1873 to the end of it in the mid-20th century. Steamers were supposed to be leisurely and enjoyable for travelers who couldn't afford the time or expense of a dahabeah. Baedeker's Egypt informed travelers that Cook's steamers were, quote, the best on the Nile, and that, quote, the company met with on board the steamers is generally unexceptionable, though, of course, they warned, it is always wise to use some little exertion to secure an agreeable and sympathetic cabin companion if one were traveling alone. The itinerary you see here, sorry for all the words, is from Cook's 1876 edition of the Tourist's Handbook for Egypt, the Nile, and the Desert. Cook's steamers, because they traveled quickly, would travel only during the day, so the scenery would not be lost to night or to sleep. As you can see, steamer trips were about 3 weeks of sightseeing at a blistering pace. Given the fact that most tourists would need at least a week for those based in Europe, 2 weeks or longer for Americans, to make the trip to Egypt and back home, this journey would be at minimum a 5-week trip. If you went as far as the Second Cataract, it could take between 7 to 10 weeks. Clearly, a steamer trip was meant for those with some leisure time and extra money to spend, although not as much time as needed for a dahabeah. Into the 20th century, Cook continued to offer steamers from Cairo to the First Cataract and back. You could get first class throughout the trip for £50, which is around £4,000 or $5,000 today. Prices went up over the next 50 years, but these trips left consistently at 10 a.m. sharp from Cairo's Qasr el Nil Bridge every 2 weeks. Steamers from the first to second cataracts did not begin operating until January of each year, and they would last until March. If travelers wished to add a week to the journey, usually either at Aswan or in Luxor in one of Cook's hotels, the price would increase by about 15 pounds, which is about 1,200 pounds today or $1,700. Actual amounts aside, first-class accommodations would have cost the equivalent of over 6 months of work for a skilled tradesperson in the same time period. So you saving, not just saving for 6 months, because that would be spending $0, but you would have to save for several years as a skilled tradesperson in this period. The currency converter at the National Archives calculates value and purchasing power, showing that 50 pounds would be the equivalent of 151 days of work for a skilled tradesperson. So these are privileged trips, is my point. Cook steamers were always touted by cooks themselves as being the best choice for those wanting a worthwhile journey for the best value. Baedekers also recommended them, quote, for the immense majority of travelers who have not more than 3 or 4 weeks to devote to a visit to the Nile Valley and the monuments of the pharaohs, end quote. There were cheaper Nile cruise options for those who could not afford cooks through other companies in business that at the time, including the Tufik Nile Navigation and Henry Gaze & Son. Their services were comparable to Cook's while on board, with food, excursions, and more, but the infrastructure that Cook had built within the country, in concert with the British colonial protectorate and Egyptian government, meant that Cooks, more than others, were able to withstand war, revolution, and any down seasons. Tufik's, Gaze, and other small travel companies were not as well established as Cook's and didn't have government contracts, so they were out of business by the coming of the Great War in 1914. By 1895, along with Murray's guidebooks, Baedeker's, and Cook's guides, there were so many travelers who had gone on steamer trips, many of them on a Cook steamer, that there were dozens of individually published travel logs that offered tourist advice on how to travel up the Nile. These books, along with more stable political and economic situations in Egypt, helped to add to the stream of visitors, making Egypt a vacation destination. They were flocking to see the antiquities, often crowding into places and leaving trash and other remnants of their visits behind. Amelia Edwards disparaged Cook steamers as being so comfortless and, quote, crowded with tourists that most travelers, in fact, dreaded the mass cruises. This review rankled Cook so much that they reviewed 1,000 Miles Up the Nile poorly in their magazine, The Excursionist. We should note that it was because of tourists, mostly brought by Cook in this period, that travel writers had an audience for their work anyway, and that Egyptologists found generous donors, so those who complained about them were walking a tightrope. Mary Helen Gerard published a detailed account of her journey as a tourist on the Cook steamer Ramses the Great, and this is an image of it. Gerard was one of the honorary secretaries of the Egypt Exploration Fund when she took a steamer trip with her husband Charles in 1888. Their boat was, quote, the largest and best of Cook steamers on the Nile. The boat carried its capacity of 62 passengers for Gerard's journey, and her travelogue about her journey, sketches from a Nile steamer for use of travelers in Egypt, was written to get travelers excited about ancient Egypt and, quote, to smooth their way through the confused chaos which the Egyptian temples often present, and she provided plans of temples and information along the way. Beginning the journey in Cairo, the steamer left on January 31st, surely at 10 a.m., and followed the general itinerary that was detailed on this slide. Upon her return to England, like many women travelers at the time, Gerard continued to have an impact on Egyptology beyond her travel writing. She translated Adolf Ehrman's work into English as Life in Ancient Egypt, and she was a noted lecturer, and she gave a number of talks and demonstrations at the British Museum. She was also an influential member of the Egypt Exploration Fund Committee, not just with her work, but also with her money, donating hundreds of pounds from 1887 until her death in 1943. Steamer travel was not all relaxation interspersed with tours and fun. The trips were fast and could be exhausting for passengers. Their exhaustion was termed by some as, quote, pharaonic malaise, or the mental exhaustion that came from viewing viewing too many unfamiliar sights and places. While travelers viewed the historical monuments and other material remains of the ancient past, they thought themselves elevated a level or two above contemporary Egyptians, mainly because of their skin color, religion, culture, and language. Of the complainers on steamers, Helen Gerard wrote, quote, "There would be grumblers, as she called them, who grumble even in Egypt, and therefore would grumble anywhere." Chaos was a theme that was heavily used throughout travel writing, but not understanding a new situation can feel disorienting and doesn't necessarily mean that everything was in disorder. Of course, all of this is not to mention that a number of Egyptian guides spoke not only Arabic, but also at least some English, French, and German, so they could communicate with tourists. Thousands of visitors to Egypt in this period took a Thomas Cook's Nile steamer cruise. Memoirs like Gerard's, Amelia Edwards, and Lady Duff Gordon's worked to get more people to travel to Egypt, and for some, to donate money to and become involved in local museums and Egyptological societies. At the very least, travelogues moved more of the public to learn more about Egypt and some to visit Egypt if they were able to afford the time and money. And you'll see, I will keep coming back to, can you even afford to do this? Sailing 1,000 miles up the Nile before Thomas Cook popularized steamer travel for European and American tourists, and before it was possible to do it by train, it was done only by private boat, either in a small cangia if it was just a couple of people, or a larger dahabeah, as you can see in this image. A typical early dahabeah was a shallow-bottomed, wooden-hulled, 40 to 100-foot long vessel. The cabin occupied half of the boat at the stern end and would hold 3 to 5 rooms, each with one bed, whose doors led out onto a small central passage, and you can see that on the left of the boat here. Each bed had room under it for storage of clothing and supplies. There was a saloon on the main deck, which would serve as a lounge, and a dining room with a big table, which for archaeologists or archaeological tourists could double as a workspace, as the room usually contained bookshelves and other communal items. The roof of the cabin would be used as an outdoor space with seating areas and usually had a cloth for its roof. You can see that here. The crew slept outside near the kitchen, which looked like a small shed on the opposite end of the boat from the cabin, and you can see it here. In the early 19th century, when boats were mostly wood-bottomed, it was wise to have your boat sunk, then thoroughly cleaned to rid it of vermin. Travelers such as Wallace Budge, Charles Wilbur, and Thomas Huxley would have had to have this done when they traveled in the 1860s and the 1870s. By the end of the century, dahabeahs were more commonly made with an iron hull, so they wouldn't need to be sunk to get rid of bugs and rats. Also, in iron boats, cabin space occupied a much larger portion of the deck, allowing for more cabins and larger saloon or other rooms, and the kitchens and crew space were more clearly separated from the traveler's space. The boats were relatively easy for a wealthy traveler to rent as early as the 1820s. Travelers would have had to pay for boat rental, including the boat and all its equipment, then separately for the captain and crew, which would have included a cook. So it was an expensive endeavor, but it was worth it if one wished to see all the sights in Egypt at their leisure, or at all. Otherwise, before Cook, people were likely relegated to Cairo. While Cook's guidebooks tended to denigrate privately rented dahabeahs as troublesome and slow, by 1895, they had a few of their own dahabeahs and ran them much the same as they would a steamer voyage, but on a smaller scale. In one pamphlet from that year, Cook told prospective travelers that passengers, quote, engaging the company's dahabeahs have the special advantage of being able to receive from the tourist steamers constant supplies of fresh fruit, vegetables, poultry, fresh beef, etc., etc. This type of advertisement informed visitors that they could reap the same convenient benefits of the steamers without having to deal with 35 other strangers for 4 weeks or longer, if they could afford it. Further, Cook's dahabeah passengers could be assured that they did not have to bargain for their boats, crews, food, or worry about anything else. Always the strongest draw of a Cook's package tour. While dahabeahs were the most sought-after form of transportation due to their exclusivity and luxury, and held the highest status for tourists, as Amelia Edwards expressed, most people, again, couldn't afford the time or expense to travel this way. Baedeker's Egypt recommended dahabeahs only to those who fit all 3 of the following criteria. Quote, those who desire to make a closer acquaintance with the country, who have an abundance of time to Aswan and back at least 7 to 8 weeks, and who are indifferent to a considerable increase of expense." End quote. According to most guides, Cook's dahabeahs rented for about 130 Egyptian pounds per month. Gaze had good boats for 110 Egyptian pounds per month, and there were others for monthly hire too. In 1895, Cook's would have cost the equivalent of 12,000 pounds or $20,000 today. Gaze's would have cost the equivalent of about 9,800 pounds or $17,000 today. Per person, though, if the costs were split evenly among a party of 4 or 5 people, you could travel in relative luxury for only a little more than the cost of a crowded steamer trip. The cost would have been about 2,300 pounds or $4,000 per person per month for 5 people on a Cook's dahabeah. One aspect that Baedeker's pointed out to travelers was if you hired a travel company's boat, such as Cook's or Gaze's, you'd be, quote, relieved from all trouble in the matter of engaging a dragoman or purchasing provisions. In the event that a traveler chose to engage their own boat, Baedeker's provided to-the-letter advice along with a sample contract between the captain and the travelers. By 1908, books were informing travelers that, quote, placing themselves under the care of a guide would help them to avoid all the petty annoyances incident to direct dealings with the natives. However, books warned, quote, dragomans are inclined to assume a patronizing manner toward their employers, while they generally treat their own countrymen with a vast air of superiority. This was, no doubt, an astute observation by the colonizers who didn't like being treated in the same way as they treated the people whose country they were in. European and American travelers were instructed to check this attitude quickly to stop the rude behavior of these, quote, mere children. When traveling by dahabeah, visitors first had to choose the boat that would fit their needs. A lot of what I've detailed here and will continue to talk about is corroborated by Amelia Edwards in her own travelogue, where she gave a beautifully detailed description of their boat, the Philae, and I will refer back to her account, of course, but also speak more generally about dahabeahs here. First of all, the process could take several days. Amelia Edwards told her readers that it took her 40 hours to choose a boat over the course of 10 days, comparing it, quote, to the miseries of house hunting, but arguing that the miseries of choosing a dahabeah were much keener. Edwards argued that the Bulak was a desolate place by the river with hundreds of boats available. Now, this image is from 30 years after Amelia Edwards was there, so it's obviously a changed place, but you could sort of get the idea of all of these boats. It was nigh impossible to pick just one of these boats. Edwards complained that many of them were basically the same. They were big enough for parties of 4, 6 would be crowded. The crew numbered between 8 and 15 men and would include the race or the captain, the steersman, crewman, a cook, and for regular tourists, a dragoman who acted as a mediator and guide. Edwards and her companions, like most travelers, were focused on the differences in cleanliness and quality, the cost of the rental, and finding a good captain and crew. Travelers were advised that they should, quote, make it clear to the race that he is not to take any other passengers or merchandise of any kind, that the whole boat shall be at the traveler's command, and that no one was to quit the boat on the pretext of visiting relatives without asking permission, end quote. All of this could be extremely onerous, especially if it was true, as Edwards noted, that most of these captains and dragomen spoke Arabic and not very good English. However, now that we have access to the diaries of Jenny Lane and Jenny Lane, Edwards and Lucy Renshaw's maid on the trip, we can see that Edwards' story may not be quite accurate. Lane's dates are actually given at the beginning of the new 1,000 Miles edition put out by the Egypt Exploration Society last year. Lane, in fact, recorded that the boat search only took a few days, and it wasn't even Edwards who did the work. The trio arrived in Cairo on November 30th, according to Lane, and on December 4th, she recorded, quote, Miss Renshaw very busy setting about our trip up the Nile. By December 6th, just 6 days after they arrived, Lane wrote, quote, it is settled that we start for the Nile on the 12th. Miss R has engaged a charming boat called the Philae. Mr. Talhami, who was their guide they had hired in Alexandria, is very busy getting provisions for our journey. These are not simply details that historians like myself care about in being able to tell an accurate story. They also speak to the importance of many different accounts in figuring out what really happened. Generally speaking, we understand now that the process is difficult and time-consuming, and for some can be very dramatic. Edwards may have fictionalized this account and others in the book for narrative purposes. She was a famous novelist, after all. People traveling on private boats didn't have to worry about people they didn't know. That is, unless they had to share a dahabeah because they wished to travel privately, but couldn't, again, afford a whole boat to themselves. Sometimes visitors would meet fellow travelers on the steamer from European ports to Alexandria and would decide to travel with them the rest of the way. Baedekers warned against doing this, however, telling those travelers that compared to a steamer trip, they said, quote, greater care is required in the choice of companions for the dahabeah voyage. For the close and constant intercourse in rather narrow quarters, and for perhaps 2 months at a time, is apt to produce somewhat strained relations between those who are not originally sympathetic. The, quote, dahabeah devil, indeed, is famous in Egypt for causing those who have embarked as friends to disembark as foes. Speaking to those traveling with, quote, scientific aims, Baedekers advised them to, quote, avoid traveling with those who have no particular interest in the gigantic remains of antiquity and who are thus constantly wishing to push on hurriedly from sheer ennui. Edwards, Renshaw, and Lane had met Mary Ann Brocklehurst and Mary Booth, known to us as the MBs, on the Simla, their steamer to Alexandria from the Italian port of Brindisi. However, both groups of women had enough money to take 2 separate dahabeahs, the MBs on the Bagstones dahabeah and the Edwards party on the Philae. Also part of this long dahabeah process was procuring provisions, usually in the final few days before departure to ensure freshness. The most popular spot for shopping was Turnbull's shop on the Frank Street, which was close to the hotels most travelers had been staying in. Travelers could buy last-minute items their dragoman hadn't gotten yet. Usually this consisted of, quote, biscuits, rice, pickles, lemonade syrup, tea, sugar, and jam, linen, teapots, feather brushes, foot baths, insect powder, and lanterns. But as travelers like Edwards and others have noted, these purchases were useful and necessary along the way. Further, many travelers who could afford this type of travel could also afford to furnish the boats lavishly. Some, like Edwards, took a piano or library of books on the trip for diversion or for research. Each party usually carried the flag of their country of origin, and sometimes they would design a unique to them flag to identify their boat as they came into various ports along the river, always sure to register them in a book at Sheppard's Hotel before they left. By the time all the luggage and the supplies were loaded, which usually took a day or 2, the group would be ready to sail, if the wind were with them. Dahabeah season coincided with the archaeological season. Sailing in October or November meant that travelers had the best chances for cooler weather and the prevailing winds coming from the north. That time of year also usually marked the highest level of Nile inundation, which meant boats were less likely to run aground. Once on the river, itineraries for private boats could vary as much as the travelers themselves, but there was a generally followed itinerary for most Westerners on a Nile tour. Visiting Saqqara and Memphis on the way out of Cairo may have been an anomaly, as tourists might have visited them as part of their pyramid field excursions while in Cairo, or just before they left Cairo as their boat was being prepared. Sometimes, though, they stopped there as part of their plan, or if the wind was not behaving and they found themselves stuck near the village of Bedrashin. Boats frequently got stuck for hours, often becoming unstuck when some of the crew would jump off the boat and pull the boat with ropes from the shore. Further complicating things, in the worst of conditions, the wind could cause a boat to capsize. Usually, because of these complications of current and weather, making sightseeing stops while traveling upriver was rare, and any pauses in travel on the up journey were often strictly for gathering food, mail, or medical supplies. There were frequent and unexpected adventures. Many travelers enjoyed remarking upon seeing a crocodile or other animals, seeing cliffs pockmarked by tomb entrances from the deck of the boat, watching the sunrise and sunset, seeing friends in other boats pass along the way, watching the crew cook, wash, sing, row, or pull. Once dahabeahs reached Luxor, some 2 or 3 weeks up the river from Cairo, the group might disembark for a few days in order to allow the crew to tend to the boat. 3 weeks on board, in close quarters, meant the space needed cleaning, and they needed supplies. Visitors were able to relax, get mail, meet people, and see the sights, but many boats went all the way to Aswan before stopping. Some, like Edwards, Renshaw Lane, and the MBs, went all the way to the Second Cataract. Then the leisurely return would begin. Tourists on dahabeahs would usually stop at the same places that steamer passengers would, but in reverse order. The First Cataract, Philae, Aswan, Luxor for temples, Karnak and Luxor, as well as the Valley of the Kings, the tombs of the nobles, and the West Bank temples. Abydos, Asiut for supplies, sometimes Amarna, and possibly Dashur, Saqqara, Memphis, and Helwan. As the dahabeahs were at the mercy and leisure of the people who rented them, few itineraries were identical. In 1905, Wallace Budge, who was then the keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum, wrote a handbook for Cook's travelers on the Nile. As all itineraries did at the time, Budge wrote about the sites in order as though one were headed upriver to the south. Baedeker's Egypt and others also described the journey upriver and gave advice on what to look for on entry into cities like Luxor and Aswan as they arrived from the north, as if on a steamer. Because most people would be on steamers or on the railway, dahabeah travelers could simply read these as they traveled in the opposite direction as they made their way home. Like all travelers, all accounts of Like all travelers, all accounts of travel up the Nile differ, but some have common themes: the Nile, the sun, and Egyptians and Egyptian sites as curiosities. The climate, people's brown or black skin, along with non-romantic language, made the whole experience somewhat otherworldly for most Western travelers. Those attitudes permeate every account. Knowing that Amelia Edwards, Lucy Renshaw, Jenny Lane, and the MBs and others were of course products of their colonial context is crucial to understanding their attitudes and the ways in which they portrayed their experiences. Because many of these same people became the founding members of the British discipline of Egyptology, Edwards herself is known as the godmother of Egyptology, they were also the producers of this colonial context. And this is still something that practitioners must deal with every day. In fact, the new cover of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile is a comment on the colonial tropes that play throughout the book and is now the Western travelers who are subject to curiosity by Egyptians. We've gone up the Nile today on trains, private boats, and more public steamers with several white Western travelers. And the question now remains, whose gaze is upon whom? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen Sheppard, for such a brilliant talk and insights into your own research on travel in Egypt. And yeah, very interesting to see some of those interesting people from the turn of the 20th century and how they did travel Egypt. So yeah, thank you so much. And just a final comment, I got my copy here of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. Do purchase a copy of the reprint of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, which includes the introduction by Carl Graves and Anna Garnett that Kathleen did consult on. And otherwise, please do check our website for upcoming lectures in the Traversing the Nile theme, which will be more on this topic. And otherwise, we hope to see you soon, either at the Open Day or another event. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you very much, Kathleen, for your brilliant lecture.
Thank you. This was great.
Yeah, thank you, and see you all soon. Bye.